I'd like to welcome all our distinguished panelists and the audience and all those participating and taking an interest in the Bhopal Literature and Art Festival. This is the third year of the relatively young festival, and we want to keep it more, as we have emphasized, as a happy, joyful, and more of a knowledge event than an event just for the sake of getting large numbers of people to attend it. So we are delighted to have in our midst today Meera Das ji, my co-director, V. Walker, all the way from Scotland. V, namaste and welcome to the event. We have Seema Raizada ji from Bhopal, the head of Club Literatai, and all my fellow colleagues as part of the organization of the Bhopal Literature Festival. I will now request Mrinalini Pandey, the anchor, to introduce the speakers and to initiate the discussion and the session on war stories. Mrinalini, to you.
Thanks, Chandraji. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and I welcome you all to the third day of the BLF 2021. Our first session for today is titled Wartime Stories. And for this session, we are honored to have war biographer V. Walker as the keynote speaker with us, who would be in conversation with Professor Seema Raizada. V. Walker is a natural storyteller and an experienced museum and heritage consultant. Her debut novel, Major Tom's War, has been a prize winner at the SAHR Military Fiction Awards 2019. Professor Seema Raizada is a professor of English at the Maharani Lakshmi Bai Government Girls PG College in Bhopal. She is a Shakespeare scholar who's done her PhD and DLit on the works of the Bard. She is also the founder of Club Literati that promotes literature and love for literature and art in the city of Bhopal. I request our audience to please write down their questions which they have from the author, either in the Q&A box or the chat box. I request Seema ji to please carry forward the session. Thank you.
Thanks, Mrinalini. Thanks, Raghav, Meera, Sulakshna, and hearty welcome to V. Walker. So good evening, everyone. And it's around noon in Scotland, so it is good afternoon to our author V.
Thank you so much, Seema. Nice to see you again.
Right. So V comes from a cold region, but she brings in so much warmth along. My first conversation with her did not sound like a first.
No,
and the reason, yes, and the reason I can happily assume is her connection with India. Another reason for her spontaneity, and I'm sure this time lies in her varied interests in life. We actually surprises everybody with her innovations.
Oh, that's kind of you.
No, because there's a reason for this. We published her first work, which was a cookbook, belonging to, I think, some 1810, if I'm correct. She took a handwritten family recipe book belonging to that period and republished it, including notes on family history of the time. And she is a photographer, and she's very fond of illustrating her talks. I mean, we'll see this very soon. And yes, given half a chance, she will sing too. So we are going to see her versatility during the session. So welcome to India and Bhopal, V.
Thank you so much.
And it's absolutely a privilege to be talking to you about your maiden novel, Major Tom's War.
Thank you.
So, as we all know, this is her first novel, and it is special in many ways. V is all set to tell us how.
Shall I crack on? Well, for a start, I'm going to show you something,
right. Yes.
if I may. Oops. Now, this is something that I was not able to bring to Punjab, to Chandigarh, to show people because it's just too big and too heavy and delicate. When you think of a diary, you think of a little notebook, don't you? A little tiny thing. Well, this is Tom's war diary. This is my grandfather's war diary. It is so heavy, I can hardly lift it. So that was the beginning of everything. That was the beginning of the story. And if you permit, I'm going to screen share here on in so that you can see some pictures.
Yes, absolutely, V.
Okay, so let's move on. So I do quite understand that not everyone will have seen a copy of Major Tom's War yet. So let me tell you a little bit about how the story began. The great big book that you've just seen lived in the back of a family cupboard. Now, all of us have something like that, don't we? We have maybe an envelope full of letters like this, or maybe an old photograph album. We all have them, and we keep them in drawers, under our beds, in the back of a cupboard. But for me, I felt that I wanted to find out for sure, for real, what was in there. And one of the first things that I discovered was this photograph here. Can you see that okay? This photograph showing the figures down below that. This is a wedding photograph. And again, how many wedding photographs do we all have? And I had always assumed that this photograph showed my grandmother, Evie, and my grandfather, Tom, getting married. And then I compared it with this train. It said 1911. Now, 1911 is before my grandparents married. So this is definitely my grandfather. Who is this woman? It was this mystery that kicked everything off. And I began to research, and I found out that my grandfather, who was born in India, he was born in Bengal in 1876. Yes, I am that old. He was born in Bengal. He lived all his early life in India, apart from being sent home for schooling in England. And he married someone who was not my grandmother for the first time. But here's the really strange thing. This lady sitting here, one of the many bridesmaids, is my grandmother. So that was the start point for investigating this very strange story.
Thank you so much, Vi, for giving that beautiful illustration. And we congratulate you on your wonderful maiden and awarded novel. Now, the action-packed plot of this gripping novel weaves together real events set in India, England, Wales, Scotland, Germany, and France.
Yes.
And I think it ends somewhere in 1918. You know, from with the retreat from the song. So it is an unput-downable book. And for me, who read the digital version, I kept on scrolling down page after page, although we suggested that I skip a few chapters, you know, as time was in short supply. But I disregarded her suggestion. And I found the narrative absolutely spellbinding. Not just the narrative, but the entire plan of the book is unique. The website, I mean, it's a very unique, I would say, because it offers archive resources where you can explore the complete diary. I mean, she has been so generous to present, you know, all her precious collection to everybody. So there is a complete diary.
My collection, Seema. It's not my collection. In a sense, it belongs to everyone.
Yes.
And as I was writing, increasingly, I felt that the story of the Indian cavalry, of the Central India Horse, Tom's regiment, which was told through his writings, through his letters, that wasn't our family story. That belonged to every single Indian soldier that fought there.
Absolutely generous. But still, thank you for that. So we can have, look page by page images, and you can actually see the photographs and text within the diary as they are laid out. And the chapter notes with people and places, they are prepared meticulously. So let's hear from V about the genesis of the novel. V, your grandfather, the protagonist, lived and served in India. So tell us about your family history and the Indian connection through him.
2 generations of my family lived and worked in or near Calcutta. You may have noticed on the silver tray on the preceding image, it said the Calcutta Light Horse. That was a reserve regiment, basically a kind of hobby army group. Tom would disagree with me, I'm sure, but it was not so formal as the regular army. And Tom, for various very good reasons, wanted to leave India. And it coincided, this desire to escape India, to leave, which I won't reveal because it'll spoil the story. This coincided with the outbreak of the First World War. And Tom, his brother Dick, also worked as a lawyer in Calcutta. Tom was an ordinary little man. He was just short-sighted. He wore spectacles. He was a peaceable lawyer, but he did have this little army aspect on the side. And so joining the regular army to fight seemed a logical next step. And the diary, page by page, documents his journey, both real and also psychological, through the First World War. You can see the page that I've shown you here. You've got photographs stuck on one side, carefully annotated in his very difficult to read handwriting. And on the other side here, you have a typescript. Now, Tom, of course, was not sitting in a dugout in the trenches typing. Nobody would do that. That wasn't possible. But my grandmother, Evie, at the end of the war, once they had married, realized how important these many, many letters he had sent were. And she began to type them up. But Evie also changed their content just a little. This is historiography. This is how we regard and change the past. Every time we talk about it, every time we write about it. And this page is a fantastic example of it. You've got a split here. That is where I ran a knife along the original document. And I took a kettle and I steamed that letter open, and I found a story that my grandmother had typed up, and then thought, no, I'm not going to show that one because it might show Tom in a bad light. And she had literally covered up history. So the diary began already to be a fictionalization of what had happened for real. And that interested me and made me think, perhaps this is not a non-fiction First World War book that would be read by very few. Maybe this could be a novel that would be read by many, many people.
Right. So you laid your hands on Tom's diary, and you found a reason to delve deeper into it because of a mysterious family death, right? But
Yes.
then there is so much more in store for the reader. Would you like to throw some light on this mystery? And then would you like to call it the raison d'etre of the novel?
I'm not sure it's the raison d'etre, but that was certainly the starting point. And I think as you go through the diary, as you see information like this, if anyone that has this kind of thing under the bed in a cupboard, start typing it up, because it's as you type up that you read it and you understand it. If you just flick through it, you'll think of it as treasure and not something that you can really get your imagination, your head round. So my advice would be, type everything up if you can. I mean, it was an emotional journey, this whole sequence of writing. I know that we come on to emotions a little bit later. I'm just looking at the time, and perhaps we'll move on to that. It was emotional because it wasn't just about my family. As I wrote it, I realized that it was about so many more people than just my family. And this picture, I think, someone conjures up what it was like. You've got Tom down here on his horse, but behind him, you've got the serried ranks of his squadron and the Central India Horse behind him. All these men drawn largely from Punjab. His own squadron were largely Sikhs, but there were people of all faiths, Hindu, Muslim, Jat, you name it, they were there. An incredibly successful fighting force, but incredibly multicultural too. So it was a fascinating discovery for me. I am not a historian, I am a storyteller, but I have become fairly familiar with the story of the Indian cavalry in France, as you can imagine.
Yeah, that's right, Vi, because when we read the novel, we get a beautiful background of the war, and in the midst of all this, you have these different characters in the novel. So these the other characters in the novel, they are also members of your family. Not Tom's parents, that's your great grandparents. In fact, the novel opens with Tom as a kid, lovingly called Tumullu. I mean, it's by his ayah, Parvati, and that was probably the invented character. I mean, I remember you have told me. And your grand aunts, the Ingram sisters, and their lives and their relationships. So they feature in the book in a very appropriate measure and in just the right places. So the book being primarily a war story, the other events give just the right kind of support with love as the centripetal force, if I interpret it correctly. And the plot being woven around war and love, tell us, how did it feel to add a bit of fiction to the lives of the people, like your grandparents and dads?
Can you imagine having to write about the honeymoon night of your own grandparents? It was that bad. No, it was funny. There were certain scenes that I knew I would have to write about like that, and I was dreading. But when the moment came, like the night itself, it all went very smoothly. And I am 25% my grandparents, aren't I? So in a way, perhaps I have a right to imagine around their lives. And the little personal elements that are woven in and out of the story felt very real to me, because perhaps my brain is wired in much the same way. But of course, it wasn't just about my family. This was about the Indian troops. It was about amazing characters like Risalda Major Amar Singh here. This is one of my favorite photographs in the book. This shows Tom wearing a lungi uniform, so he's wearing a turban, as all cavalry officers did, standing beside the man really who was one of his best friends and certainly one of his dearest comrades on the Western Front, Risalda Major Amar Singh. Now, Amar Singh was not just an officer, he was also the spiritual leader of the Sikhs at the time. And unintentionally, the book began to open up this world of the Sikhs worshipping in France, the Sikhs carrying the Guru Granth Sahib before them through France, finding church halls and barns in which they could pray and use as gurdwara. Quite remarkable stories which no one knew before I started to transcribe the diary.
Right. So this book, that's as you just mentioned, it has a very strong Indian presence by way of Sikh characters. And you rightly mentioned the Risaldar Major Amar Singh. I mean, he's such a stalwart amongst the Indian characters, and he's the leader, the Granthi to the cavalry Sikhs on the Western Front. And then there is this Dafadar Arjun Singh, who's Tom's young Sikh groom. Midwo.
He was Hindu. He was Hindu, not Sikh, actually.
Okay, Arjun Singh was a Hindu, and then Harnam Singh, Risaldar Harnam Singh. I mean, there's a beautiful chapter on him. I mean, I think in the just beginning of the novel, you know, when he would remember his dead wife. I mean, it would be only very, very late, you know, in with the connection with Harnam Singh, that people would come to know that his wife is talking about his dead wife. Yes. And then Tom's self-appointed protector, who is a Sikh cavalry officer.
May I read you, perhaps, for those people who are listening who haven't read Major Thomas War, let me read you a little tiny snippet from that chapter. Would that be a good idea? So I want you to imagine what it was like for the Indian troops coming off the ships at Marseille in the south of France. They've come across the Kalapani. They have arrived wearing pretty thin cotton uniforms, sandals. They don't have the sort of uniforms that they need for winter in the south of France when it's very cold compared with India. So what happens next? This is what happens next. Their French admirers soon realized how poorly prepared the Indian troops were for an unseasonably cold Marseille in October. Most of them had marched off the ship clad only in the thin cotton tunic uniforms they'd worn the day they marched on board in Bombay. French winter garments of many different shapes and sizes began to rain down on them whenever they paraded, which was often. Initially, Harnam Singh ordered his men to keep marching and ignore the offerings. But after the first few bitterly cold nights under canvas, he saw the noble figure of Amar Singh, not only his Risaldar major, but the man who acted as his Granthi too, stoop to gather up a thick blue scarf. So Harnam Singh allowed the lapse in discipline. The march that morning down the wide avenue lined with grand apartments, which the French called a boulevard, rapidly deteriorated into a free bazaar. Harnam Singh himself had accepted a soft shawl in bright green and gold, now twisted twice around his neck to keep out the chill. All the sleeping men were bedecked with other woolen garments. One lucky fellow, the envy of them all, lay cocooned in an old fur coat he had turned inside out for snugness.
Yeah, that's so nice. That's very touching, in fact, I remember, you know, when there's a talk about these soldiers, you know, they were so ill prepared for the war, and they do not have proper footwear also. I remember, you know, there's a mention of the one, you know, they were wearing sandals and getting all sorts of, you know, the problem in their feet. So that is the kind of backdrop that we have and the kind of problems that the Indian troops face with. But in the face of, you know, but everything, you know, with all the problems, with all the shortcomings there, these men, you know, they make up for all the unhappy, you know, things in their lives. So yeah, we will talk about that later, but let me just ask you one thing. Mm-hmm. When you started writing this book, what were your emotions like because, you know, both for your family and the forces, especially when you were so far removed from the entire war? I mean, you were born 10 years after Tom's death. So I have two questions, one, what helped you connect with him, the officers and the Jawans who fought with him? And secondly, how much of war and peace you understood through their lives?
Oh my goodness. I think I read an enormous amount around the Indian army, the Indian cavalry, beyond the diary itself. I got sucked in, if you like. One book which I would commend to you is David Omissy's Voices of, I think it's called Voices of the First World War, Indian Army Voices of the First World War. Marvelous little extracts from letters. But one of the difficulties with the Indian soldiers was they did not write They did not keep diaries particularly. They were ordered not to, largely. But they also did not write letters home saying, "Ah, this is terrible," you know, because they knew it would get stopped by the censor. So their letters tend to be practical. Their letters tend to be full of details about, you know, cattle and wives and domestic details. But clever soldiers like Rasalda Major Amar Singh they were able to write in a kind of code. He used poetry, he used Gurmukhi verse to communicate his own emotions at the horror of war. And I found that intensely moving. It's been an emotional journey as well as a literary one. Mira, you're quite right, yes.
So yes, we especially, you know, when it's something like war and the enormity of the war. So I feel more than a glimpse of the army lives during the war years, the happy and the sordid, love and hate, because there are characters which are not very loving, or lovable. Then the courage and cowardice, faith and misgiving. So all these emotions, you know, can be experienced in the war zone. So the descriptions, of the recce and the night marches are both thrilling and funny. Now, simultaneously, there are harrowing tales of execution of soldiers like Yadaram. So besides these, there are instances of grim outcome of loneliness and desperation among the officers and soldiers. So how did you grapple with the scale and range of tough events and emotions?
When you look at some of the Facebook groups, for example, which celebrate the Indian Army in the First World War, they are very celebratory, very commemoratory. They tend not to look at the honesty, the grittiness of how it was, the reality of it, which was absolutely grim. These poor men were not allowed home leave. These men did not see their homes in India for the whole of the duration of the First World War. The officers were sent to Paris sometimes, you know, for some nice propaganda photographs or whatever. But really, it was a very unnatural world. These guys were restricted there. You saw incidences of sexual abuse, of course you did. You saw drug abuse. They had morphine. And you think you wouldn't take morphine if you had it when you were in the trenches? Some people did, and not for injuries. And of course, they got addicted to nicotine because they were given cigarettes. That interests me as much as what kind of gun they were carrying, you know? The boys tend to be more interested in the toys. Perhaps women writers like myself are more interested in the emotional realities of trench warfare. I don't know if that's a fair comment or not.
Absolutely, I remember to, you know, have really been touched by the execution of Yadaram.
Oh, yes.
Yes. That was absolutely, and Tom's, you know, the conscience, the kind of call of duty on Tom's part, and the kind of his, you know, the emotions that probably were never expressed, but he must have certainly gone through them, because he was there, he was right there when he had to execute his own one of the men. And that is something which, you know, which must have been a very common thing to happen then. And also the life and the practices, you know, that were carried out, the routine exercises that were carried out in the trenches. So the life, the trench, would you, tell us something about that? Because that aspect.
Trench warfare, again, we tend to perceive it as something rather glorious. We have images of people rushing over the top, brandishing their weapons, you know, to death or glory. But the reality was, it was sometimes desperately dry. The dryness of the trenches, the hard baking heat of the trenches was far worse than the wet, which is the opposite of how films portray it. If we think of 1917, for example, you get lots of mud, but no kind of baked dry, no water scenarios. And I think that it was boring. It was really boring. They had to sit there and wait to be shot at. And that, any real soldier will tell you, that is the reality of warfare. It's not the exciting all guns blazing bits. It's having to come to terms with the sheer dreariness and dread of, and I think that affected the psychology of a generation. In a way, it's still affecting us today, I think.
Yeah, so did you happen to visit some places that are mentioned in the book, or the memorials that, that are related to these places?
I did. In France, I went to Neuve-Chapelle, which is the Indian Army memorial, very, very moving place, planted all about with neem trees, I think, and just a beautiful, tranquil place. But I noted particularly there that on the memorials on the wall are commemorated the murder victim, the murderer, and also one of the officers who dies simply of an injury in the book. And these three names in the book are there equally commemorated. And I felt that's absolutely right. Yes, there was a murder. Yes, there was a victim. But there is no way, in my view, that the murderer was any less of a victim than the victim, if that makes sense, because these were all acts being conducted in this hideous atmosphere of the trenches. But the most extraordinary journey I took was to Punjab. And here you can see the dear granddaughter and grandson of Rasalda Major Amar Singh. And look, the family have built a school in memory of the great man, and there is a statue of him in the grounds. And I was able to leave a little poppy cross. We have these poppy crosses on the 11th of November, and I was able to leave one at his memorial there, and meeting his family, meeting his great-grandson, Dipinder Sandhu, a wonderful, unforgettable experience to make these people my friends when, Tom and Amar Singh had been friends, and also to meet the descendants of Arjan Singh, and also Harnam Singh. We couldn't track down any family belonging to Harnam Singh, so perhaps his line died with him, I don't know, but he lived quite near Amar Singh. But to travel around Punjab was extraordinary, and that kind of opened up a space in my mind towards my next book, which is working title Brother Joe, and some scenes from that will now be set in Punjab. Because of that journey. So it was an incredible experience. And it was last December. So how lucky was I? I got there just before the COVID outbreak. I am so fortunate.
Right. So tell me one thing, after you visited India, was there something that, that crossed your mind that you should be writing something more about them, or something differently about the Indians? Would you like to, would you have changed something about them?
I did change the second edition of the book, because this is, oops, let's just go down to this one. This is what the second edition paperback looks like. So if you're thinking of getting a copy, make sure the cover looks like this. I changed the second edition in a number of ways following that trip to Punjab. And I must here just wax lyrical about my astonishing publishers, who are called Kashi House. And Kashi House, well, they are a tour de force. They are a group of Sikh gentlemen who publish for the love of it and for the love of their Sikh heritage. And this is their first novel. They took a real punt on this, as we say. It was, but they didn't know that it was going to be as successful as it has been. And look, we're now in the second edition. There's a Kindle edition. I'm hoping there might be an audio book at some point. But this book has the added chapter of the arrival of the troops in Marseille. That was missing before. I wrote it, and for very good reasons, it was excluded from the hardback because it was felt to be perhaps one voice too many. But I argued strongly for its inclusion in the second edition, and everyone agreed now that it would be good. Were I beginning again? having done everything that I've done, having been to Chandigarh, to Punjab, to met the regimental family. You see I'm wearing regimental colours, folks, in Delhi. I would perhaps write more strongly in an Indian voice. I would have that courage. But at the beginning, I had never been there and I couldn't. I felt it wasn't for me to write in that voice. As a white writer, I would have to be incredibly careful writing in the voice of a person of colour. And this chapter was as far as I felt able to go. But I am so glad it's there. I'm so glad it's there because it was like a smile with a tooth missing for me before the first edition. So it's great to have this out here.
All right, so maybe there's mention of Calcutta. I mean, the novel starts with Tom's life. Soon after he grows up, it moves very fast in the beginning. I think by chapter 2, Tom is working. In chapter 1,
yes.
He's the child, and chapter 2, he's already working, and so much happens. So, would you like to tell us something about the life of Tom in Calcutta?
Yes, well, I mean, he was a mild-mannered Calcutta solicitor. And I felt it was very important to start his life as a small boy with a particularly unhappy family life. I mean, these Britishers that lived in India at the time, they were often quite callous, hard-hearted people. They sent their children away to be educated. Sometimes they abandoned them in boarding schools. Sometimes they couldn't even bear to say goodbye. They would just leave their kids there and disappear. This happened. Incredible damage psychologically that this did. So Tom was damaged by his childhood. And I think he was looking for happiness the whole way through his life. And strangely, he found happiness in the trenches with his Indian cavalry comrades from the Central India Horse. I began every single chapter, or rather every single character's story with a childhood episode. And in Chandigarh, a general who interviewed me said, I have read your book, it is very good, but I could have done without all the childhood rubbish. Why did you bother with all that? We could have gone straight into the guns and the trenches. And I said, yes, sir, but you would not have understood the characters without that childhood element, especially Lockdo, my baddie, who represents the British ruling class. I felt you had to understand his very dysfunctional childhood, and you have that scene where his father dies tragically and he reacts in a very strange way. That was important to me because without understanding him, you can't understand how those people managed to perpetuate the war for as long as they did.
So I think the central part of the novel, or the trigger of the novel, I would like to call it, was the mystery of the member of the family. Would you like to tell us something about that?
I can't tell readers too much about it because nobody will read the book then.
Yes.
There is a hanging, what we call it, as an author, I would call it a hanging storyline. And right at the beginning, you discover that Tom has something of a guilty secret. And this secret is sustained right the way almost to the end of the book. Suffice it to say that my grandmother was not at all keen on Tom when they first started communicating by letter. She had very good reason to absolutely hate him. And so the story unfolds from there. That is the mystery that keeps you going. So it's a murder mystery, it's a love story, it's a war story, it's historic fiction, it's an unintentional epic. And there we are. I didn't write it, I just started to transcribe a diary. Anybody could write a book like this. Just get your envelopes out from under the bed and start writing.
Something about your grandmother, Evie. I mean, she's such a wonderful character. Would you like to tell us something about her?
Evie was a would-be suffragette. She tried to go on a march. There's a chapter about that, which will tell you that it doesn't end happily. She was a very strong woman. She had no time for sentiment, Evie. I have inherited lots of bits of broken china because she never mended anything. She didn't think of things as very important. For her, it was people who were important. So I've got all this beautiful, quite valuable china, but it's got a handle missing or a chip or a crack. It's just like that. But I'm conscious of the time, Seema. Perhaps we should be moving on to, do we need to allow time for a few questions, do you think?
Yeah, I'm just looking at it. We do not have just some observations, but no question. But yes, we can invite questions from the audience. If someone has a question, can write in the chat box or Q&A. And meanwhile,
but I'm quite happy to keep chatting. The funny letter in the center here, this squiggly thing, that is the first glimpse, and it's the first public glimpse I've given of the mystery that underpins my next book. And the working title is Brother Joe, although I suspect it'll end up being called maybe the Patiala letter, something like that. This letter is postmarked Patiala. It is signed, we think, Joseph here. But other than that, no one can translate it. We have tried everywhere. British Museum, Delhi, Lahore, everywhere. And it's not that it's a strange language. It's just whichever Munshi wrote this, he wrote it incredibly badly and we cannot decipher what it says. But it has something to do with the death of Joe. And that's all I'm going to say. Quite an exciting.
Raghav has a question.
Can I ask a question? Yeah, can I ask a question or two?
Right, of course, Raghav, that would be lovely.
So we, Scotland has produced so many luminaries and so many great artists, not to talk of authors and people of literature. And we just lost Sean Connery a few weeks ago. And I remember Seema ji organizing a Sean Connery event in Bhopal based on his, on the literature around him, around Ian Fleming's James Bond. And so, one thing that I've been always curious about, because I studied in a convent educational institution, La Martiniere in Lucknow, which also has a parallel institution in Calcutta. So we did have a lot of Scottish teachers who came over, and, McGraths and Laportes and various others, Mackenzie's. So what, Scotland is in the Highlands and it's cold there. So what could have impelled so many Scotsmen to come to India in the late 1800s and early 1900s? What would have been their fascination or curiosity about, Tom, for instance, to serve in India?
Yes. I mean, Tom went out as a lawyer, but of course, the bulk of Scots went out there to make money. We're good at it. We are good at making money. They would have gone out as part of the East India Company, John Company. You look at the names within the East India Company, and many of them are Scots. And there are also parallels between Indian history and Scottish and particularly Highland history, which interests me, and something worth exploring at some point, Seema. Perhaps it would be interesting. But you have partition, for example. Well, we have a border between Scotland and England, which was a legal union. But then there were wars. We've had a rebellion, a rising here, which did not come off. That there are so many parallels, and the way that the diaspora from India has gone shot all over the globe is exactly the same way in which Scots have ended up going all over the globe, and sometimes not for very dissimilar reasons, to make money, to support families, to find a better and more interesting way of life. Plus, if you've ever lived through a Scottish winter, sometimes you want to get away from it.
Right. All right.
One more question is it's about your Scottish literature.
Yes.
And you've produced so many greats right from school. We've all been reading Walter Scott and Treasure Island, R.L. Stevenson, and J.M. Barrie, and of course now the famous J.K. Rowling's, and we hear the Auld Lang Syne is so much a part of our, New Year's time. There were several versions of Auld Lang sign which was sent across, sung by different groups.
Absolutely.
So, tell me, what is it in the DNA of Scotland to make it so artistic? And the Scottish people, despite the fact that they look, as you said, they're looking at the best opportunities to go out and make money, but there is so much intrinsic artistic talent in them. And maybe, is that why J.K. Rowling's, in fact, when I went to Edinburgh, I walked across to this, and let me mention it to, and you know it, of course, that there is an Elephant Cafe there. And
Yes.
it's a small little
Yes,
coffee shop on the
yes.
main road, which has a little placard there, and they've put it up that J.K. Rowling's was in a very, very poor financial position after a divorce. So she used to sit here and have coffee.
That's
and
right.
After that, she wrote Harry Potter and became rich. So,
and it's now making them rich because they charge twice as much for coffee there as they do. Oh, no, that's unfair.
So what is it in the DNA of Scotland to make it so artistically?
I think it's because we have a separate education system from England, for example. And I think it's superior. I think we've had a very good system of education here in Scotland for an awful long time. We have separate universities, and we've valued education for millennia, really, almost. It is in our DNA. But also long, cold winters. What do? You read, you sing, you tell stories. Everything at the end of the day comes back to the story. Now, you've mentioned singing, Rajav. So I wonder whether, let me see if I can get rid of that title box. Yeah, there we go. I wonder whether we could end with a song. Would you like that?
We would just like to, take up a couple of questions here.
Oh, we've got more, yes, absolutely.
Yes, before I would have anyways asked you to sing, but let us take these questions first. This comes from Meera. She says that I'm curious about the 8th slide and would like to listen to her on that.
The 8th slide, which one was that?
Slide.
Which
like to
one?
Go? The 8th one. She says.
The song that you are going to sing.
Oh, this one.
Oh, that of course will come very soon.
A little background to that, maybe.
All right. So
yes.
There's another question here. There's another question from Rima Huja. She says, you have, can I read the question, V?
Yes, of course, please do.
Yeah, so she says, you have been following many leads to trace fuller stories of several of the Sikhs and other Indian soldiers Tom was in command of or came into contact with. So will you please share some of those?
Yes, certainly. One of the most touching was an email that came in after an article about the book had appeared in the Chandigarh Tribune, which is one of the big English language papers up there. And I got this lovely email in very carefully sculpted English from a gentleman called Dinesh Rana. And Dinesh is a descendant of Arjan Singh. And it was just lovely. And it said, when you come to India, you must come and see us. So I thought, well, okay, I'm going to go to a book festival in Chandigarh, to the Military Literature Festival in Chandigarh, thanks to the team there. But I thought, well, I can add some time onto my journey. Maybe I could go and see some of these people. And so I ended up in a tiny village called Mojawal, which is in the far northwest of Punjab. No, northeast, I beg your pardon, northeast of Punjab. And I was welcomed like, a celebrity. I've never had anything like that happen before. And there was food. I've eaten my body weight in dal makhni, which is absolutely delicious. And it was just such a happy day. And all because this lovely gentleman took the trouble to send me an email, having seen a little article and a photograph in the paper. So it was almost like the story was reaching out to me as well as me doing the research, if that makes sense.
Right, thanks, V. And right, so, you have recently discovered, now this is about the song that you are going to sing. to us. So this was discovered by you recently, that the Indian soldiers in France sang a famous British marching song with their own words in Hindi.
Now this was around on Twitter. I use Twitter a lot. My handle is bwalkerwrites if anyone wants to follow me. And a British soldier had written this down, but phonetically, in very bad phonetics. So we were trying to work out whether it was Punjabi, whether it was Urdu, whether it was Hindi. And then my friend Shivajit in Chandigarh, she managed to find this on some obscure website. And so I've been trying to sing it. Now, I don't speak Hindi, I should say that. I've not had time to check whether the pronunciation is right. But I thought, well, if any of you know the tune, you can join in wherever you are in the world, you see. So come on, let's have a go, okay? Buradur hai tipereri, buradur hai janiko, buradur hai tipereri, mera chokri dekhne ko, salam Piccadilly, Leicester Square, pura hai tipereri, lekin mera dil hai wa.
That's amazing. That's amazing.
Wonderful.
Oh, great fun. Great fun. Thank you, Shiv. There we go.
So, yeah. So, Raghav, is it time for us to wrap up?
You have another 7 minutes.
Okay, so we can invite some questions.
I thought Mr. Abhilash Khandekar said, posted a comment. Would you like to read that out?
Yeah, please. Yeah, yes, there is, of course, one by one of the best urban planners was Patrick Geddes, who designed many Indian cities. He was a Scottish polymath, and he taught in Mumbai University. Yes. So that's, what is he's sharing his observation on the Scottish people. And that's something to make you feel proud of, right?
Oh, I am proud. I mean, I have one, my family is both English and Scottish. I have connections and a bit of Irish blood too. So I'm sort of well and truly rooted in many cultures. But I see myself as European, so I'm sad at the moment. Yeah, I think Scots have done a lot for the world. I think Scots have maybe also done a lot of damage to the world. Let us not forget that many Scots owned plantations in the West Indies, especially in Guyana, and slavery funded much of the Scottish Enlightenment. So it's not all good, I'm afraid, the Scottish connection. In our love of making money and business, sometimes morality has been overlooked. And I think you can certainly argue that in the case of Scots' involvement in the East India Company too.
Right, yes, we do agree. I do agree with your observation on this. And ultimately, it is the people of the world, you know, who actually form a chain of humanity. I mean, we do come from different countries, different parts of the world. But see the magic that you have woven in this this novel of yours. And but writing about war and documenting the travails of the forces and people alike. It's not just about forces, not just about the officers and the soldiers who are fighting the war. It's not easy, I would say. And then to combine with the experiences of the families back home, that heightens the impact of any conflict. And here is the First World War that engulfed the nations across the world in a way that we who are almost 100 years, yes, almost, I mean, very close to that, 100 years removed from it, cannot imagine the tragic sweep of death and despair. So we, thanks a lot, you know, through your documented narrative, you have woven the story of the discovery of a long forgotten family tragedy that led you to spend almost a decade researching and writing Major Tom's War. So
Thank you.
congratulations
Thank you so much.
once
Thank
again.
you.
I just want to say one thing, if
Yes,
you'll
Meera.
allow me.
Yes.
You know, in 1915, there's a whole lot of letters which are kind of going to London. And a large part of them are about the Sikh families who had gone, who were writing to the soldiers, the Sikh soldiers who were there for World War One. And so Postal Department in India has kind of published some of those. And it'll make a fascinating reading in case you would
Absolutely,
like to
yes.
see.
Yes.
So,
I mean, my bookshelves are groaning with books on India, and that was not how I expected this journey to end. But I just can't get enough of it. And I visited Patiala on my book tour last time in December, and Patiala plays a big part in the next book.
Right.
That was very enlightening.
Thank you so much.
And thank you for the illustrations, the photographs, and the narration of the stories the way you narrated it.
Now, so I would like to attend the next session too. So should I go out and come back in again, or should I just mute myself?
You can just mute.
I can just switch on I can switch off your video and you can be here.
Oh, that's great. Thank you so
much. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Bye, everyone. Bye.
Bye.
It was lovely chatting with you.
Great having you over. Thank you, Seema ji.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, V. Walker. Thank you, Seema ma'am, for this wonderful session. We learned a lot about Major Tom's life, especially his life in Calcutta, about V. Walker's grandmother, and some interesting discussion about great Scottish people, especially the cafe where J.K. Rowling used to write her book. And while the session was going on, I purchased Major Tom's War on Kindle, and I'm surely going to read it tonight.
Oh, I love you.
Oh, that's smart work.
Yes, I actually remained glued to my seat and I was listening to it. It was really fascinating. As a history student, I found the session to be really, really amazing. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mrinalini. Thank you so much.
Thanks for learning.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much. So now we proceed towards our last and next session for this evening. And this session is also based on history. And it is titled Recreating Voices from Our Past. And for this session, we are honored to have a distinguished and esteemed author, Mr. Manu Pillai, as the keynote speaker, who would be in conversation with Mr. Tinu Disa and Professor Seema Raizada. Mr. Manu Pillai is an author and a historian. His debut book, The Ivory Throne, Chronicles from the House of Travancore, has won the Tata Prize for the best work of non-fiction in 2016 and the Sahitya Academy Yuva Puraskar in 2017. Mr. Tinu Disa is an IS officer of the 1980 batch. He served as the Chief Secretary of Madhya Pradesh for more than 3 years. He's currently Chairman RERA, and he's a distinguished author of 2 books known as The Disrobing of Draupadi and One for Sorrow, Two for Joy. Both are collection of short stories. Professor Seema Raizada is a professor of English at the Maharani Lakshmi Bai Government Girls PG College. She's a Shakespeare scholar who's done her PhD and D.Lit works on the Bard, and she's the founder of Club Literati that promotes the love for literature and art in the city of Bhopal. I again request our audience to please write down their questions which they have from the author in the chat or the Q&A box. And I request Mr. Disa to please carry forward the session. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrinalini. Good evening, everybody. And on behalf of my co-host, Seema Raizada, I welcome all of you, all participants in this Bhopal Lit Fest, and a very special welcome to our chief guest of this session, Manu Pillai. I'm not given to effusiveness or exuberance, but I must confess that I am a fan of Manu Pillai. I mean, Manu is half my age, but for me, he's a hero. He's a literary hero because he combines in himself 2 of my favorite things: good history and good writing. I mean, Manu is really one of the finest historians we have in India today, and one of our finest writers. He writes with finesse and élan, and his books are engaging and honest and colorful. And even though they are not fiction, they are page turners. I mean, those of you who've read even one or two of his books will agree with me. And those of you who haven't read even one book of Manu, you are missing something. Manu frees Indian history from labels, whether they be labels of religion or labels of ideology. He just frees history from all kinds of labels. And to me, Manu represents a bridge that spans the gulf between many things. It's a bridge that spans the gulf between historian and writer. I mean, you have good historians, but whose writing is dry as dust. But Manu's books are not like that. So the gulf between historian and writer, a bridge that spans the gulf between scholar and layman. His books can be referred to by, PhD scholars or postgraduate students, and they can be read just by laymen, just like that. Manu is a bridge that spans the gulf between North and South, and between the past and the present. So there you have him, Manu Pillai, the hero, Manu Pillai, the bridge. His first book, as Mrinalini told us, was The Ivory Throne. It's a 600-page book, I think approximately 600 pages, and it chronicles the history of the kingdom of Travancore. And that's the one that won the Sahitya Akademi Yuva Puraskar. His second book is Rebel Sultans, is perhaps the definitive work, the definitive work on the Deccan, and it is the most significant book on history, not just of 2017 when it came out, but I think of the decade. It's a marvelous book, which presents the Deccan in a way that you've never seen it before. I mean, all of us who studied history, actually, the history we've studied is Delhi-centric, things that are happening in Delhi and elsewhere, and we know that something is happening in the South. But to us, the South in general is very straight-laced, conservative, steeped in tradition, slow-paced. So something is happening there. But Manu's Deccan is something else. He shows us a different kind of India, a different kind of Deccan. It's a Deccan that is vibrant, a Deccan that is welcoming to foreigners, whether they be Europeans, whether they be Africans, a Deccan that is open, eclectic, and a happening place, Manu's third book, which came out just last year, what's it called, Manu? Is it The Dancer, the Saint, and the Latin Priest? No. It's the courtesan, the Mahatma, and the Italian Brahmin. So it's a book with another interesting read, little vignettes on history and illustrations. But Seema will be talking in greater detail about that. Manu, my first question to you is based on your Rebel Sultans. As you've said, it frees Indian history from the grip of the North, and you refocused Indian history. But the subtitle of Rebel Sultans is The Deccan from Khilji to Shivaji. Now, Khilji and Shivaji are themselves, again, in a sense, northern characters. So have you once more surrendered to the prism of the North, or is there some special reason for that? So, Manu.
Thank you very much for that very kind introduction, firstly. On the title, it's interesting that you point that out, because there was this glowing review in Studies in History, which is an academic journal, except for this final quibble at the end about the title, and said that so much for unhinging the Deccan from Delhi. Even the idea of rebel sultans, why are they called rebel sultans? Because the sultanates were born in rebellion, within the Delhi Sultanate, and thereafter the successor states were born in rebellion within the Bahmani Sultanate that emerged. Yes, I mean, the reason I went for Alauddin Khilji to Shivaji is because the period I cover is not the earlier, the medieval period, which is the Yadava kingdom and the Devagiri and Hoysalas and so on. But the moment where Alauddin Khilji enters the Deccan as an invader and sets off something new, it's sort of the beginning of a new chapter. And one can sort of draw that line all the way to the emergence of Shivaji, which is sort of the close of that chapter. Shivaji emerges on a stage that has been set for him, and the stage was set by these sultanates that emerged in the post-Khilji period. And then, as all empires, as all kingdoms, they all eventually decline. There's always a high point, and then there's a time of decline. And it is in the decline that you have a new force emerging in the form of the Marathas. So, I mean, of course, Shivaji is usually spoken of in terms of his great conflict with the Mughals and Aurangzeb in particular. But here he was meant to represent the idea of a new beginning, and it was what many historians call a Hindu empire. He himself called it a Hindavi Swaraj. He was very conscious he was doing something new. He was turning the page and starting to write a new chapter. So I thought, that nicely encompassed the period that I was trying to cover. But you're right, at the end of it, there is still a little whiff of Delhi left in the title, and even in the fact that I call them rebel sultans, because of their rebellion and their sort of breaking away from Delhi originally.
Manu, it's interesting that you should say that some people see, Shivaji's Hindavi Swaraj as and see him as a Hindu king. And but when you speak of, say, for example, the Battle of Talikota, which took place in 1565. And when the confederacy of these sultans defeated the Vijayanagar Empire, and just 10 or 12 years after that, you have the Battle of Haldi Ghati in the north, where the Mughals defeat Rana Pratap. Now, both these battles are shown, are depicted in many either history books and even in movies as battles between insider forces and outsider forces, between Hindus and Muslims. But you have a somewhat different take on this in your book. Can you tell us something about this and about your views on insider, outsider?
Yeah, I think we often fall into a trap, which is to either say that the past was all highly syncretic and everybody was very happy and there was no religious conflict at all, or we go to the other extreme, which is to say that everything was defined by religious conflict. All kings, all empires, they were motivated primarily by religion. But the truth, as in most cases, is somewhere in the middle. Now, even in the case of somebody like Shivaji, the difference is that when we speak of religious identities in that period, it is not a communal identity as emerged in the colonial period. So when we talk about a Hindu majority today, that is a product of the census, because the census is what for the first time told a large category of people, look, you belong in this box as the majority, you are all called Hindus. Whereas, earlier such conceptions of a communal identity did not exist. But religion did inform politics in the space of kingly identity. Shivaji is an excellent example for this, because Shivaji, when he anoints himself king in the 1670s, towards the end of the 17th century, in that time, he does use a religious idiom and a religious vocabulary to legitimize himself. Kings tend to do that. When you're essentially a warlord, you're a new power, you need legitimacy. And the constant source of legitimacy in those days was to fall back on religious ideas and classical notions of kingship, which were deeply wedded with religions, protector of cows and Brahmins and all that. But what is interesting is if you just go one generation before or two generations before, Shivaji's own family, his father's name was Shahaji, his uncle's name was Sharifji, and his grandfather was the Nizam Shah of Ahmednagar, one of his courtiers. Now, the interesting thing is a poem commissioned by Shivaji officially in the 1670s as one of these legitimizing instruments of his kingship. In that poem, it's called the Shiva Bharata. There is this fascinating line which talks about how Shivaji's grandparents could not have children for a very long time. So they went to a local holy man and asked the holy man for blessings, and he blessed them. And he said, you will have 2 sons and they will be great, etc., etc. And he gave them certain, physical objects and it sort of blessed them. The interesting thing is the children that were born, Shivaji's father and uncle, were named after that holy man, Shahji and Sharifji, because the holy man's name was Shah Sharif. He was a Muslim. He was a Sufi saint. So what you see is Shivaji's own father is named after a Muslim Sufi saint. His uncle is named after a Muslim Sufi saint. His grandparents, when they wanted children and wanted divine blessings, they went to a Sufi, not necessarily to a temple. If you go to the samadhis, as they called, of Shivaji's grandfather and other relatives in Maharashtra near Ellora, the structures resemble Islamic tombs because that was the conventional style of architecture at that time. But what is it that causes a Shivaji to sort of call himself in this poem an incarnation of Vishnu here to destroy the Mlechas, by which the reference is to Islamic kings? What causes him to declare that he wants a Hindavi Swaraj? Why does he decide to stop writing Persian letters and privilege Sanskrit and sort of resurrect Sanskrit as the language of diplomacy? Because now he's become a king. He's no longer a warlord. And kings need this kind of ideology. You reverse it and you look at Islamic kings sometimes. And you look at Mughal Emperor Babur, for example. He comes into India. There's this time before he arrives where he's desperate. He needs assistance from the Shah of Iran. Very conveniently, he decides that instead of a Sunni, he's going to become a Shia for some time. Gets the aid he needs from the Shia king of Persia. As soon as that business is done, he goes back to being a Sunni. Then he comes into India. If you read the memoirs that he left, he's talking about the gardens and the fruit or how bad the fruits are and how bad the gardens are and so on. But he's not really talking about religion. Religion again enters the situation when his best governors are fed up with India. They don't like the climate. They don't like the place. They've all gone back to Afghanistan. He's faced a series of defeats from Rajput kingdoms around him. And it's finally in this massive showdown between this alliance of a grand alliance of Rajputs who are coming to destroy his already demoralized forces. That is where he pulls out the last trump card he's left, which is jihad. And he uses the jihadist vocabulary to rouse his troops and sort of raise their morale and so on. So again, it is in a certain context that he ends up using that language. It doesn't mean kings were constantly thinking in those terms. Kings were using that as a legitimizing process. They were using it to win a certain amount of public approval, perhaps. Look at even someone like Tipu Sultan, tends to polarize people a great deal. What is interesting is while he's invading Kerala, and this is what leads to the Third Anglo-Mysore War, he's invading Kerala, he's talking about destroying the temples that are connected to the local rulers. At the same time, he's also sending Shivalingams to the Sringeri Matha within his existing Mysore territory. At the same time, he's also telling the Jagat Guru at Sringeri, this is how you must do pujas to these lingams, and these are the exact places where these Shivalingas should be consecrated. At the same time, he's talking to the Sringeri Matha head, where he's cast himself as the protector of Hindu Dharma and the Marathas, who are technically Hindu, as these agents of Kali Yuga. Kali Yuga is this horrible time where all of Dharma goes up in the air and it's all disaster. So the difference is this, where he's invading, where he's an invader and a conqueror, he uses the language of religion to justify the conquest. In his settled territories within Mysore, so on the one hand, he's calling them infidels in Malabar, but at the same time, he's talking to the so-called head of the infidels, the head of the Sringeri Matha, and sort of patronizing him, sending him money, sending him idols to consecrate and so on. So the kings use religion in very interesting ways. The problem arises when we take our current communal identity, which was born only in the 19th century, and try and apply that to and project it backwards and say these kings were all protecting the Hindu community or the Muslim community. That doesn't really add up because that's just not how it worked in those days. If you lived in a sort of localized area, your holy man could be a Hindu or a Muslim, it wouldn't matter. People would go equally to both. It didn't really make a difference. It was at the kingly level, at the elite level, that religion did have a certain political relevance, which we've now appropriated and sort of used for our politics today. And that's really where the tragedy lies. So, insider, outsider, these questions which have these religious parameters, they're usually born out of mischief rather than a contextual understanding of history. If you understand what happened in the past in context, nothing will surprise you. It is devoid of context that everything starts looking really alarming and horrendous and scary and all of that. But I think context makes all the difference.
You say nothing will surprise you, but the incident that you describe, or the not the incident, but the fact when you talk about Ibrahim Adil Shah II from Bijapur actually calling himself Saraswati Putra and saying that Ganesh is his guru and things. So this kind of this really surprised me, happening at that time. But now, if that wasn't in a context of war, Manu, why why would he be doing that?
There are a few theories about this. Nobody's really put their finger on this, but there are a few scholars working on separate areas. And if you read their work, you'll find that there are these parallels. Why is it that Ibrahim, Akbar, these are all contemporaries? And the grievance usually with the Mughals also, that a lot of scholars, they quibble with it now, but in general, what is said is that Akbar represents that syncretic high point. And then as you come down the generations, by Shah Jahan's time, it's become a little more orthodox at court. Again, not the rest of the public, but the court has become slightly more orthodox in an Islamic way. And Aurangzeb, of course, takes it to its next level. You find something similar in Bijapur as well, where Ibrahim sort of represents this highly diverse, highly open-minded kind of a situation, where he's talking to Nathpanthis, he's talking to Christian padres who are traveling in from Goa. He's got, he's a Sunni Muslim himself. So there's all of this happening. And then a couple of generations later, you find a backlash where there is this sort of resurgence of religious orthodoxy. So there is something happening in those 1.5 or 2 centuries. Nobody's really put their finger on it, but there is something happening. But again, the interesting thing is these are kings defining themselves. One of the things we know about Shah Jahan, for example, is that he sort of deliberately made his father look like he was entirely in the palms of Noor Jahan, and he was this opium addict and a drunk who had no control, and it was a woman who controlled him, because in those days that was meant as an insult, and that he was constantly, not suitable to be a king. The intention behind making his father look bad was to make himself look better. And, so each king has a certain vested interest in making himself look distinct from his predecessor, because otherwise, what makes you special? So everyone has to come up with something constantly to make themselves look better. And Shah Jahan, from everything from, growing out a beard, where his father just had a thin mustache, Shah Jahan sort of at one point grows out a beard, which is an act of sort of asserting his own personality and saying, look, I'm not my father. I'm much more devout. I'm much more recognizably orthodox. You go down the generations, you have the same with Aurangzeb also. Aurangzeb wants to conquer these kingdoms in the Deccan. And he comes to destroy the last of them, Golconda, which is ruled by the Qutub Shahs. And his own, the mullahs at court, they themselves tell him that, hold on, this is a Muslim kingdom. If you're justifying this in the name of religion, you can't, because one Muslim king may not defeat another and conquer another Muslim king. So of course, Aurangzeb says, oh, they're Shias, and therefore they must be destroyed. The irony is that his own mother is a Shia. The irony is that many of his generals are Shias. It's an excuse again. He's using it for political needs at that time. But the soul, the original sort of inspiration is not necessarily religious. That is deeply political. Religion merely supplies a sort of cladding to give it. And you can give that a positive thing also, which is what you see with Ibrahim Adil Shah II, which is that prior to him, there was his uncle. He was obviously inspired by the uncle. The uncle used to call himself Adil Shah Sufi. The story goes that when he used to travel, he used to take cartloads of books with him, even into the battlefield. He, he's left this written treatise in which you've got all kinds of tantric goddesses and a translation of, supposedly the only translation of a Sanskrit treatise on Varshik astrology, whatever that means. There are lots of Hindu goddesses painted into this. So that uncle was to begin with already somewhat, interesting in his mindset. And this uncle had, he was the adopted son of the Raya of Vijayanagara. And that's ironic because he's the one who ends up defeating the Vijayanagara ruler at some point. But, what is interesting is that it was possible to cross those bridges in that century. And Ibrahim in some ways represents the high point of that, after which you again start seeing a sort of regression, if you can use that word. So all of these, they need to be sort of teased out a little bit more, because what we have for now is similar patterns in different parts of the country. It's happening in Agra, it's happening in Bijapur, it's happening further south. But why does that change later in the century? We don't yet have a fully convincing answer.
In fact, it seems it was much easier to cross those bridges 500 years ago than it is today.
Apparently,
anyway. Seema, would you like to?
Yeah, so, when we are just talking about religion, so in your latest book, Manu, The Courtesan, the Mahatma, and the Italian Brahmin, you have presented historical nuggets through retellings of the familiar as well as the lesser known episodes and characters. And the narrative often centers around religion, caste, class. I mean, this is in context of the first part, the part 1, before the Raj. Of course, there are other issues as well. So how do you associate the history of our country with religion, caste and class? And how do you perceive the future of this relationship?
Interesting question. One thing is that I've learned increasingly not to look at it as this is the history of our country, because one of the things we often make a mistake, with is when we shut our eyes and think of Indian history, we somehow see a map of India, right? That's our idea of India. But that India is very new. It's only 70 years old. You can't really project what Indianness meant 500 years ago to our current map of India. For example, somewhere I think I write about how Delhi had a lot in common culturally with Kabul than it had with South India. Kerala had a lot in common with Arabia than it had with North India. The founding political legend in Kerala is about a Hindu king who divides his kingdom with among his family members and then ships off himself to Arabia because he wants to become a Muslim. And the story goes, he saw the prophet splitting the moon and therefore he's been inspired to convert. So Kerala and the Gulf, it's not a new relationship. We've had it for 1,000 years. There's a copper plate, a king's grant that he gives out in the 849 or AD or around then. And it's interesting because among the witnesses are not only local grandees and aristocrats, but also lots of Arabic signatures. Because by then, Muslims were enough of an integral part of Kerala culture via the trade contacts with Arabia for that to be perfectly normal. The story goes that one of the first mosques in Asia in India was established in Kerala in the lifetime of the Prophet. So if you look at it that way, the current map of India doesn't necessarily, it's not one united story. This is, as I often say, it's a mosaic of many, many stories happening. Some of them sort of, go beyond these boundaries that we now have. Some of them may, restrict themselves within. Still coming to religion, one interesting thing is, of course, recently there's this rather alarming case of a comedian who was arrested for hurting religious sentiments. And it reminded me of the second essay in this book, The Courtesan, the Mahatma, and the Italian Brahmin, about the Maratha king of Tanjore.
Yes, there is.
Chhatrapati Shivaji's
there's a play.
His half-brother's son, this is the branch of the Marathas that went to Tamil Nadu and set up their kingdom in Tanjore. And when you use words like multicultural, what is interesting is, again, not a very new phenomenon. The Marathas the kings of Tanjore were Marathi speakers. Their court language was Telugu, because from the Vijayanagara time, Telugu had become this highly elite language. They, of course, knew Sanskrit also. Their subjects were Tamil speakers. They had Rajput, Afghans, and all kinds of other generals and soldiers. So already a very mixed up sort of court. Now, this gentleman writes, this Marathi-speaking prince writes a parody of the caste system. And this is the early 18th century in the Telugu language. And it translates, it's been translated as Take My Wife. The name is Satidana Suramu. And it's about this Brahmin priest who's on the way to a big temple festival. And he's going there with his chela. His name is Moru Bhatlu the Magnificent, and this is his chela with him. And on the way, they see a very beautiful woman in the distance. And the Brahmin says, halt, I want to go flirt with her. And then the chela says, no, you're a great Pandit, you're a great Shastri. Think of the subtle meaning of Vedic words. And this man says, no, I don't want this insipid eternal bliss. I want the bliss that comes with spending some time with this lady. Now, the chela can't control him, so the Moru Bhatlu goes off to the lady. Lady turns around and so happens she's a Dalit woman. She's from a leather working caste. So first she says, no, sorry, I'm married, so I can't have any dealings with you. And he says, that's okay. Think of, as you would give me your loins as you would donate land to a Brahmin. Then the lady's fed up. She's like, what do I say next? So she says, look, we're of a lower caste, so, you can't have any dealings with us. And he says, no, we invented all these rules just to hoodwink people. You come with me. And then the lady's getting even more agitated. And, finally she sort of says, we are of such low caste that we drink liquor and we eat cow's meat. We eat beef. Therefore, we're not pure enough for you. And Moru Bhatlu says, I drink cow's milk and I worship the cow. You eat the cow, you must be purer than me. Now, this is an 18th century Maratha king, Shivaji's nephew, writing this in the early 18th century. And what I often say is that he had the cultural security to be able to parody the caste system. This was performed year after year in a temple festival. It was consumed by the local people and they used to laugh at it. So in the 18th century, they had no qualms about making fun of the caste system, making fun of these so-called cherished ideas of the religious orthodoxy. It's amusing that in the 21st century, there is, a comedian can be arrested for apparently hurting religious sentiments and is reduced to having to say that he has a Muslim name. So he's reduced to having to say that, but I crack jokes on Muslim subjects also. It's so devastating, firstly, if you think of it, from a political sense and having to live in the present. But it's also not necessarily our culture. Our culture has plenty that is highly amusing, that is highly open to humor, that is highly open to dissent and criticism. Criticism is not a new thing. You go back to the 12th century and you have Basava's Vachanas where he says, loaded with the weight of the Vedas, the Brahmin is a veritable donkey. Can you say that today? You could go back to the 19th century. Why the 12th century? 19th century. Jyotiba Phule in Pune is told by the Orthodox, and Pune is this like hub of Orthodox, Brahmins in the Western India. And they tell him that, Brahmins are superior because they're born from the head of the cosmic creator. And he immediately asks, does that mean the cosmic creator was, menstruated through the mouth? Because it was possible. This was dissent. This was standing up and saying the inconvenient thing. And it was possible in the 12th century. It was possible in the 19th century. But somehow, today our skin has become thinner. And we somehow seem to lack the cultural confidence and security to be able to laugh at ourselves. This is ultimately that any confident civilization can laugh at itself. That is the point of confidence. But the very fact that we can't even make jokes today, which our ancestors made without a second thought, is, I think, it tells us something. Maybe that is a lesson we should draw from history instead of other lessons about who killed whom and for what reason.
So even Basava's associate Ramava, she would write erotic verses. I mean, as early as you just mentioned in the 12th century.
Yeah. In fact, that's the other thing, right? We again think that our ancestors were extremely chaste all the time, and they thought only pious thoughts all day long, and sat up with their spine erect, and meditated all day. It's simply not true. There is more than enough in our literary corpus that is, that tells you that they were as human as us. They had as human, desires and failings and strengths and weaknesses, whatever you want. And they were not gods. They were human beings. They were made of flesh and blood. And a lot of Indian poetry, especially Bhakti poetry, it does use that human connection, what we now call erotic perhaps, or sensuous. It uses that connection that human beings can form with each other in love to represent a higher connection with God. So for instance, there is Telugu Bhakti poetry, which emerged in the Nayaka period, the post-Vijayanagara period, where you find that God is treated as a customer who's come to a courtesan. And the courtesan's affection with the deity is not, welcome and I'll roll out a mat for you, but it takes the form of berating the deity, saying, I saw you going to that other one's house the other day. Why don't you go back to her? Why have you come to my house? You're basically telling God off for having gone to another courtesan first. So there is this highly personalized, almost, it's sweet, there is of course sensuality, there is an erotic element, but that's what makes it wonderful, right? It breaks all these notions of purity and piety that we have. People were able to express themselves sometimes in the most direct of ways, in the most heartfelt of ways. You have Muddupalni, she's one of the courtesans I cover in the book, again emerged from the Tanjore Maratha court, where she writes this Telugu poem called the Radhika Santvanamu, which is about Krishna appeasing Radha, because Radha has got him married to her niece Ila. And then as soon as the marriage is done, Radha is extremely jealous that Ila, with her body as soft as bananas, that's an actual reference from the work, is now going to sort of steal Krishna away, and she won't have Krishna to herself. So she stamps her foot and she sort of gets very angry. And Krishna has to come and appease her. What is interesting here is, again, the sensuality. Krishna at one point does this dialogue where he says, even when I'm not in a mood, even when I'm tired, she insists we begin the game of love. Because that is the dialogue you have with God. God is not some transcendent, distant being. This is God in a physical human form. You celebrate God by celebrating your emotions, your desires, your cravings, and your humanity. You're not trying to, perhaps that's what, a lot of other religions wanted to sort of transcend. And we also had plenty of people who wanted to get moksha and leave behind the material world. But here is a celebration of the material world. Here is a celebration of the carnal and the human. And, that's part of our history as much as, Puritanism. Right.
So, Manu, just a question on what makes, history, what we call history. So I feel, every era would have its apocalyptic and annihilative moments. For instance, the COVID-19 pandemic in our own lifetime. And then there are some lesser ones in intensity, but nevertheless overwhelming. But what may be history material for one may not be for another.
True.
And so not every seemingly important thing goes down in history. So my question to you are two. One, what's the stuff that history is ideally made of? And secondly, what are the dilemma, if any, moral or intellectual, that a historian like you faces in separating the grain from the chaff?
You know, what is interesting is when we often think of history, the pedestrian idea is that history is what is in the records. You know, people will often say, where is the written evidence? Where is the proof? Where is the inscription? Where are the documents? But again, the problem with that is documents and written material are one part of the puzzle. They're a big piece and they matter, but they're only one part of the puzzle. Especially in a caste society like India, where literacy and the very business of creating documents and records was limited to the elites, you know, to the upper classes, the upper castes, and, you know, the literate castes. That's not the only place where historical memory is stored. You know, it exists in song, in lore, in legend. I mean, discounting that simply because it isn't written down is not necessarily the fairest of things to do. History exists in art, it exists in architecture. You know, we know, for example, this particular king I mentioned in Tanjore, Shivaji's nephew. Now, if you read his official documents and inscriptions, you would get the political king. But it is through his literary creation, a work of fiction, a parody, a play that he wrote, that we get an insight into the man's mind. That also tells us something about society as it existed at that time. You talk about Tipu Sultan, go to his summer palace in Srirangapatna, the Darya Daulat Bagh Palace. Magnificent mural paintings there. And there's this one striking painting of the Battle of Pollalur, which shows the British being defeated by Tipu's people at that battle. And what is interesting is how Tipu's depicted everybody in that. So there's absolute carnage, heads cut off, arms cut off, all of that is happening. And Tipu shows himself sitting on this oversized horse, smelling a flower, smelling a rose, as though he's in the middle of some wonderful garden, because he's, you know, a great monarch. On the other hand, the English colonel is shown sitting in a palanquin, which is supposed to sort of convey effeminacy, chewing his nails. So that work of art is not a written record, but it is communicating something. It is a political message of what the king is trying to show of himself and how he's trying to show his enemy. So you've got art as a reference. Same with the Vijayanagara period. You know, you talk about Krishna Deva Raya. You have what the Portuguese have left of him, which is, you know, eyewitness accounts of what he was like, what his habits were like, etc. He was stocky and he had smallpox marks. We know that much from a Portuguese record. But you go to Tirupati and you see a bronze that Krishnadevara donated to the temple of himself and his consorts. And, you know, it's in that old Chola style, very lean body, where he's wearing this Persian style cap. That bronze is also telling you a story. You know, it's an artifact, but it's also encapsulating history. Similarly, as you go down the caste system, a lot of stories, especially a lot of counter narratives, are preserved not in written records, but in oral history. Even an event like partition, for example, we have the statistics. So many people displaced, so many women assaulted, so many people who had to run away, etc., etc. There are the numbers and there are the hard facts of it in the government files. But, you know, Achal Malhotra did this book, on partition, where she basically goes to survivors of that episode and talks to them about material memory. You know, so sometimes a small lota you brought with you from what is now Pakistan, it's just a lota when you look at it. When I look at it, it's just a lota. But for the person who brought it, it acquires a different meaning. That one small object is what they managed to get from home. What jewelry they managed to stitch into their clothes and secretly bring with them, that has a different kind of meaning. You find partitions, facts and figures in the files, but if you read Monto's short stories on partition, it's fiction. But a future historian will refer to it anyway because it encapsulates the emotional angst of partition. You know, where there's that story called Koldo about this woman who disappears, and then, you know, her father finally finds her. And when they're in the hospital, if I'm not wrong, they sort of, you know, cleaning up her body, etc. She's been raped. And she sort of willingly sort of pulls down her trousers because she thinks that somebody else is going to rape her now. It becomes like this mechanical act for her. It's a fiction story, but it encapsulates what many women went through at that time. Because a lot of women didn't speak openly. So Manto was giving voice to something that happened, something that was stigmatic, but necessarily needed to be told, at least in a fictionalized form. So a future historian will not just refer to the files, but also to how it appears in fiction, how it's been represented in film, how it's been represented in subsequent writing. All of this matters. You know, it's not, so when you speak about sources of history, history comes from all kinds of sources. It is not just, even gossip, even rumor, even, there's a story about how Hyderabad is named after a courtesan called Bhagmati. And what is interesting is that The king who established Hyderabad, he never names a Bhagmati. He lists all his favorite wives and concubines in one of his written works. There is nobody by that name in that work. But what we do know is that the Mughals were a little angry that such a glamorous city was being built when they looked down on the Qutub Shahs. Here the Qutub Shahs were building one of the great cities of the world. And the Mughals were very unhappy with this. So they put out this propaganda story, this little, tongue-in-cheek kind of thing that, this place is just named after a hardened whore. And therefore, it's not a city worth of respect. Even that gossip has a certain historical value. It tells you how even, the elites in those days did transact not just in written records and inscriptions, but also through other means, ranging from song to gossip to place to, all kinds of things. So yeah, history comes from many, many sources.
Right. So you mentioned about women. One last question on the courtesan, Manu, that you tell very powerful retellings of the women in your book, the female voice, as you say, whether she be Tulukka, Nachia, the Turkish princess, or Shakuntala, I mean, the two versions that in Mahabharata and Kalidas. Then Ramavi, who just mentioned, Basava's associate. Then Kunza Begum, and then Minakshi, the goddess with 3 breasts, and Nangili, the woman with no breasts. Then Mirabai and Mudapalani, and finally the titular courtesan, Begum of Sardana. So from the poorest to the goddess, what is it in these women characters that caught your attention, and how have you positioned them in the historical or mythical milieu of the country?
I've always wondered, that we have these books that come out on the history of India, right? And yet for some reason, there is still no book on the history of India told through its women. We've got great heroes, we've got history told through kings, we've got history told through nationalist fighters, etc. But there's nothing that takes a sort of long sweep of history and looks at just the women and what were the women doing in that period. And I realize there's a huge gap there. And it's not because the material doesn't exist, it's because we are not conditioned to look at that material as serious. You mentioned the Begum of Sardana, Begum Samru. She begins life in the mid-18th century as a dancing girl in a brothel in Chandni Chowk. Gets married to a German mercenary of all people, because there were plenty of Europeans as mercenaries in India in those days. She's not even his wife. She's like this lover / mistress. When he dies, she edges out his son, gets rid of the son, and she claims the loyalty of these troops, and she becomes the head of an army. This ex-dancing girl who's now a warlord, in her own right. At multiple occasions, when the Mughal emperor is besieged in Delhi, in his capital, Shah Alam, it is she who goes in and rescues him. And he then titles her pillar of the state, daughter of the emperor, all kinds of things. And once, of course, the East India Company comes up, she transfers her allegiance to them, dies in 1835, one of the richest women in India at that time, having built one of the greatest churches in North India, in Sardana, left physical monuments, etc. Now, one of the interesting things is she has a contemporary called Mahatji Scindia, who is, of course, a great warrior, great strategist, a great Maratha icon. But again, the Scindias also come from modest roots. They, the story goes, the ancestor of the Scindias was the slipper carrier of the Peshwa. And then, from there, they rose up in the hierarchy. What is interesting is that one rags to riches story gets a lot of attention because it's a man who doesn't transgress any social boundaries. But the woman who is not policed by a Mangal Sutra around her neck, who's not got that social sanction, she is not considered equal to him in any respect, because she's, at the end of the day, what is she? She's just a courtesan, because that apparently doesn't give you any right or any claim to respect. But you look at what courtesans have achieved in a country where a lot of women were, or a large portion of women were illiterate, did not have access to sort of expressing themselves in a historical, in what would become a historical record. Courtesans are one source where they do leave a lot of writing. They had physical autonomy, sexual autonomy, financial mobility. They were women who were creators of culture. One of the first official and modern drama companies set up in South India was by a courtesan called Balamani. One of the great churches, as I said, was Begum of Sardana. Even the idea of epic women, right? Why do they keep transforming? Why does Shakuntala in the Mahabharata, who's very forthright and very direct and looks Dushyanta in the eye and calls him a liar, why does she become this coy, helpless woman who's constantly weeping in Kalidas's version? In the transition, you can see how society is also changing. Society doesn't want that kind of woman. It prefers this kind of woman. Then when you come to the Victorian age, again, they're translating Shakuntala in a different way. They're removing any hint of sensuality and turning Shakuntala into a Victorian nun. And, that's the Shakuntala who eventually gets fed back to us. So if you look at women, you can find a lot of the inconvenient questions of history in it. Because, if history was written by the men, then women are the big question mark. And they hold up a mirror to all of those histories and sort of give us some of those, inconvenient elements that we're not necessarily always brave enough to tackle.
Talking about women, Manu, somewhere you mentioned that it was your grandmother who sort of influenced you in the art of telling a story. So would you like to share some of that with us?
Yeah, well, she was not like most grandmothers where you expect that, of course, we did get the stories from the Ramayana and the Mahabharata and all that. But there were these amusing stories she would tell about her own family members, about her uncle. One hilarious story was about this uncle who, these are upper caste men in those days, they're not supposed to drink and so on. So he goes off to drink something at this local lady who has a little shop. And then the lady gets raided by somebody, and then he has to go and hide in a mat. And I found it really interesting because growing up, there was this very wonderful photo of this old man with a garland on it kept there as though he was some great saintly figure. And to just visualize this man in his younger avatar rolled up in a mat in a lower caste lady's drinking hut, it made him more human. He wasn't some superhuman figure. He wasn't great uncle. He was just a human being. So that irreverence she brought to her own ancestors, to her own family, has made me also look at historical figures as not necessarily heroic as we're normally taught to think of, but as human beings who navigated a different context, but were very much human, in that process. They were not, it is posterity that raises them into gods and puts them on pedestals. It is subsequent generations who imbues them with that kind of quality. In their own time, they were perfectly, natural. They were perfectly made of flaws, and they had their comical traits as well. They had their controversial traits as well. Ibrahim Adil Shah, who you mentioned earlier, there's this amusing bit where he's come to terms with Akbar, and Akbar sends him an ambassador saying, now you must make sure this is a marriage alliance. Get me an Adil Shahi princess for the Mughal harem. Now the ambassador gets there, and Ibrahim decides, look, I'm forced to do this. How do I delay it? So first 4 years, Ibrahim simply bribes the ambassador to keep delaying the final treaty. So the ambassador is also enjoying because, and this tells you about politics also, right? And how sides were not so clear. You're technically associated with the Mughal court, but here you're eating the bread of the Adil Shah just to keep, the Adil Shah happy and keep him content. Now, finally, Akbar figures out what's happening. So he sends a fresh ambassador with a strict order that you may not spend more than one night in the Adil Shah's capital. You have to finish it in that time and bring back the princess. And, of course, when the ambassador is about 2 weeks away, Adil Shah stops him and sends a messenger saying, look, I'm very busy. I can't receive you now. I've got some important things to do. And bombards this man with biryani, with dancing girls, with any kind of distraction he can find to prevent him from coming closer. Finally, the man comes, and Adil Shah again tries to sort of woo him and say, oh, why don't you spend a week here? Why don't you spend a month here? Why go away so early? The man says, no, I have to. My emperor's commanded only one night. And the story goes that, Akbar had this little club of his called Din-e-Ilahi, which was, people of the same intellectual bent, etc. And they used to wear a certain badge, which the emperor would give to those who had been inducted into this very elite select group. And this gentleman, the ambassador, had one of these. And Ibrahim looks at it and says, can I have a look? And takes it. And he says, oh, well, you see, I consider myself spiritually a member of this club, so I'm going to keep this. Thank you very much. Bye-bye. And this ambassador then loses another 2 weeks because he has to, on the one hand, he can't stay in Bijapur. He has to leave the capital and camp outside. And then he has to negotiate for the return of this particular badge because he can't go back to Agra without it. In the meantime, while all this is done, the Adil Shahi princess decides to try and run away in her own right and come back to her father. So she has to then be captured and brought back. It is hilarious when you look at it. It is so funny. And we never think of it in those terms. We think kings sitting on their horses or elephants looking very serious. No, it could be quite comical. Politics, if today we have resort politics where MLAs are locked up in resorts and all kinds of comical things happen as news anchors try to jump over the walls, they had their version of comical politics in those days as well. It's just that we have to be able to connect with them in that sense, to be able to see that richness. And for me, that's why I use a lot of historical figures to tell the larger history of that time, because I think human beings connect better with other human beings. Rather than speaking of the time in the abstract, it's better to make it about the stories of these people, because If you look at them irreverently and just as human beings, you connect with them better. And you realize that, hold on, the context may be different, the century may be different, but core human impulses are often the same.
Talking about today, Manu, things like, there is this trend of trying to retrofit history and try to see history from our viewpoint today. And on WhatsApp and things, there's so much fake history, instant history that keeps floating around. What do people, how does one react to this? Or should one react at all? Does one feel a duty to correct the record, as it were? How do you deal with this instant history, this fake history?
Yeah, on the one hand, social media is great if you're actually making the effort to know what you're talking about first. But on the other hand, you're right. There's a lot of, for the want of a better word, a lot of rubbish that is peddled very easily, and which can sort of transmit itself very quickly and reach hundreds of thousands of people without actually having any basis in fact. And that is something of concern. I've learned, earlier I thought maybe it's worth combating this, but I realized no, not really, because the people consuming this are probably not interested in that kind of thing. And so I've decided I'm just going to keep writing books, and hopefully whoever picks it up will sort of figure out the correct perspective, at least, or at least what we think is the correct perspective at present. But this is the thing with social media history, right? Which is that I often see spats on Twitter, two people disagreeing about something. Someone will go on to Google Books and they'll take a screenshot saying, look, for example, this particular Sultan says here he destroyed 20,000 infidels a day. Proof that he did this. Now, the thing is, a historian knows that you never take historical material at face value. Even your evidence is interrogated. What language is it written in? What is the intended audience? Who wrote it? What are they trying to achieve through this text? These questions put the text in context. So if this text talking about how 20,000 Hindus are being butchered on a daily basis is written in Arabic or Persian, it is not intended for a local consumption. It is intended for consumption in the Islamic world towards the West, where this particular Sultan, again, to construct his own legitimacy as a good Muslim, is trying to tell those people, look, I've destroyed so many infidels here, therefore you must recognize me as a great Muslim king, as an ideal Muslim king. In reality, could they get away with doing it? Impossible, because local economies would collapse. Even someone as horrific as Tipu Sultan in Kerala, who did do a series of things that were not very pleasant. One of his closest ministers was a Brahmin called Purnaya. And when the British destroy Mysore and Tipu dies, Purnaya actually goes to the British and says, install his son as the next ruler of Mysore. Don't install the Hindu royal family. This is a Brahmin who's basically saying, keep Tipu's family, as the sultans, because the earlier Hindu families lost its political relevance. It's the British who then bring back the Vodayas or the Hindu royal family in Mysore. So again, the context gets removed, and you look at one document or a Google Books excerpt, and it says that this is what happened, and you decide that this is categorical proof. But no, not really. When Vijayanagara takes Madurai and they destroy what was a very brief Madurai Sultanate in the 14th century, there's this work called the Madhura Vijayam that was written, which talks about how, under the sultans, the blood of the Brahmins was flowing in the streets, the blood of the cows was flowing in the rivers, the temple was ruined, etc., etc. Now, of course, there may be a grain of truth in this, which is that, maybe the sultans didn't want the temple. They didn't really care for the temple. Temple was neglected. Could be true. But again, the question to ask is who's written the text? The invading Vijayanagara princes. It's not clear if it's a wife or a concubine, but a lady who's one of his close associates. So it's not a person without a vested interest in this. She's part of the invading army. Secondly, what language is it written in? In Sanskrit. So it's not addressing the local Tamil people. It's addressing the local elite and an elite outside to say, look, we've restored dharma here. And thirdly, the problem also is that Vijayanagara was a Kannada/Telugu enterprise that's coming into Tamil Nadu, which had its own Pandyas and Cholas, etc., and trying to set itself as the new imperial power. So to make themselves look less foreign, they have to make the previous people look more foreign. So you have to find common ground with them, which is the restoration of dharma and temples, which they did have in common, and show that, oh, look, the previous rulers were not like this, therefore we are better. But in reality, did that work? Not really, because you find that Vijayanagara, within a few decades, has to concede a lot of autonomy to these Tamil territories, because Tamilians did not see this Kannada/Telugu empire as their empire. So Vijayanagara had to allow those districts to retain their autonomy. So again, that one text, the Madhura Vijayam, which may be peddled on social media as proof that Brahmins and cows were being slaughtered in Madura in the 14th century, there is it is very likely there is an exaggeration in this, and the exaggeration is intentional. Even the Battle of Haldigati, Rima ma'am may know more about this, but as far as I know, the earliest sources you find talk about, I think, a few hundred dead. And then, as time passes, it becomes a few thousand and then tens of thousands. Why even go as far as that? In the 1960s, a bunch of Gorakshaks went to Gherao Parliament, and I think 6 or 8 people were killed in the police action that Indira Gandhi's government took at that time. They, of course, raided Kamraj's house, as the White House, or the Capitol, was recently raided in Washington, D.C. So they raided Kamraj's house. 6 or 7 people were killed. I think it's 6. But today, if you go to these ultra right-wing websites on the internet, it talks about unmarked graves to thousands of Gorakshaks killed at that time, and that Indira Gandhi's government buried them in all kinds of secret places. It's fascinating how in a space of 50 years, a precise figure, goes into tens of thousands of pious lovers of the mother cow destroyed by a villainous Indira Gandhi. But this is how embellishments happen. And social media has merely allowed that to happen at a much quicker pace and to reach people much more quickly. But my own faith, which may just be optimism, is that people will learn to look beyond it. The thing is, in an initial phase, a new thing always may dominate, but very quickly people learn to see what is wrong with it. It's like Facebook was wonderful when it first came. Today, everybody's talking about getting off WhatsApp and Facebook because their privacy is imperiled. And in 10 years from now, it's very likely these companies may not have the influence they currently possess. So I think these things can also be transcended, provided some people make the effort. So hopefully, talking at literature festivals and speaking even to a small audience means that tomorrow, if somebody in the audience gets one of these rubbish WhatsApp forwards, they can reply and say, hold on, I think this is not quite correct.
Right, Manu. Manu, we have a few questions here in the chat box. Walker, we just chatted with her. She was an author in the previous session. She wants to know that the characters you describe sound very real to you. Do you think an author of fiction or of non-fiction has to have a strong visual imagination in order to inhabit his characters?
I mean, the one advantage I've had is that I usually tend to travel to a lot of these places. And I think that really impacts what you write. Because in the case of these sultanates, for example, I'm able to sort of write better about those places I've directly seen. I wasn't able to see all the ruins and all the places, but the places you've seen directly do give you that visual sense. So when that Aurangzeb came and besieged Golconda and that he parked his guns atop the tombs of the Qutub Shah, the previous Qutub Shahi rulers, when you read about it, it's okay. I mean, you vaguely construct a visual image, but when you actually go there, look at the Qutub Shahi tombs and picture the fact of the gun sitting on it, pointed towards the Qutub Shahi fort, and attempting to destroy the fort, it does add something. It does give something of value to that. So I think seeing and being able to sort of personally access and relate with things is I think of huge value to whether you're writing history or even historical fiction.
Right.
Manu, my question is it takes off from there. I mean, I still can't get my head around the fact that you've come out with these 3 books. Within a period of 4 years and before you're 30. How do you do it? I mean, how do you actually do the kind of research that is required for this? And, I know we've read that you've gone to Oxford, etc., but you spent your school, your youth, you're still young, but I mean your school days in India. What kind of effect did that have on you? And, do you see yourself more as a historian or as a writer, or do you think that, or you don't make that difference in your mind?
Yeah, I think the last point, which is that I've increasingly realized a lot of these categories are being broken down now. And I think that's, again, part of the evolution of things. One of the things is that a lot of wonderful historical research is being done. The tragedy is that it is often limited to the seminar circuit and it doesn't really reach anybody beyond. And increasingly, you have people trying to bridge that. And I like the word you used for me earlier, that the idea of bridging that distance. Now, on the one hand, I'm doing my PhD. It's in London, actually, not in Oxford. So I'm doing my PhD. So I'm trying to sort of, that equips you with a certain rigor in handling your material and knowing how to access the archives, how to sort of interrogate your material. So that definitely helps. But all the same, given a choice between writing an academic tome that will give me, 20 peer-reviewed, articles or whatever, versus writing something for what is called the trade press or for the general audience, I would prefer the general audience, because I think it serves, especially in today's time. We can't cry disinformation. We can't cry that history is being twisted and then not make an effort to make history accessible. I think it is highly important that history should be made accessible. And including, one of the great wonders of the last 5 years is how much is being digitized. The National Archives in India, of course, are digitizing, but libraries, places around the world are digitizing their material. Images, you don't really have to go to Paris to look at the visual collection they have at the bibliothèque over there, but you can actually see it from here. You have to pay a certain license fee. It's expensive, but it's much easier than it was 10 years ago. I do find that, as for how I've published, now the thing is, the first book took me 6 years. I started at the age of 19, and of course my first drafts were hideous. And I'm glad I didn't publish it in a hurry, because it would have been a terrible book that would have gone down without leaving a trace. But because I spent those 6 years on it, it was, firstly, it gave me a lot of training in how to manage the archives, because the first book is connected with women born in the late 19th century and who died only in the 1980s. So the material is intense, it's very rich and it's very dense. So even sifting through that, I think, equipped me with a certain amount of skills over those 6 years. Then it entailed interviewing people, looking up art by Ravi Varma that existed from that period, who was the protagonist's grandfather, all kinds of things. And those 6 years were really solid, which then meant that for subsequent projects, it was easier because I knew exactly how to go about it. I had spent, usually people do that in a PhD. In my case, I didn't do it in a PhD. When the book came out, I was asked by multiple people why on earth I hadn't done this as part of my PhD, which I should have, because it was that kind of work. And that's really, I had a head start in many ways. And I took a sort of bold and risky decision at a certain time when, everybody tells you to have secure jobs and so on. I decided, no, look, this is what I'm enjoying doing. And I managed to turn out one book, and it did well, which gives you the confidence to then take a risk and do your next book. And that did well as well. So, it sort of boosts your confidence, and then you can get a little more certain about your plans and so on. But
and what are you researching in your PhD, Manu? What is your thesis?
7 core, but not because I spent 6 years on it, I focused, of course, on this biography format of the last female Maharaja there and her great vendetta with her rival, the sister. But what is interesting is that in the course of that, I found a lot of material which left a lot of questions. Now, everything doesn't belong in one book. And I mean, even the book I wrote was 700 pages. You said 600. It's actually 700. 104 pages are notes. But, I managed to sort of cram in a lot into that, but it still left me enough to chew on. And I kept thinking I have to go back to it at some point. So now, in a very academic sort of way, I'm sort of going back to the same region and the same state, because I've already spent 6 years on it. So it makes sense to sort of stick to that field and take my PhD in that.
Right, Manu. So we're running out of time. Just a couple of questions here, short ones. I don't know whether they're short or you have a long answer to that. But I just want to know, I mean, how do you think should history be taught in schools and colleges? And any suggestions to researchers?
No, schools and colleges are difficult. Colleges slightly better because the material that is recommended reading improves a little bit at college level. Schools are the tough thing, because you see, school textbook writers are given a mandate. You have 100 pages, you have to cram Indian history into that. And that's not an easy ask. When it's such a diverse country with so many layers and so many languages and complexities, how on earth do you make it fit 100 pages? So you end up having very dull history books. And kids, by the time they come out of school, most of them have no interest in history. They call it a mark-losing subject, which is what all my friends said. And I used to love it. But, that wasn't, the thing is, for most people, that wasn't the case. I think the real answer is a sort of tough thing, which is that people just have to read. I think we have to inculcate the idea of reading in people. And once people start reading, then they'll pick up books related to history as well. And that, I think, will have an impact.
I'll just share.
Yeah, sorry?
Sorry, please go ahead. Sorry.
No, on researchers, just as I said, due diligence, don't be in a hurry to publish. It's just better to be patient and to do things slowly, because then at least you can be assured that you're doing a better job. As opposed to a half-baked thing which you'll regret in 5 years. So, it's take your time is what I'd say.
So you just mentioned about, how history is forgotten soon. I'll just share with you my bumpy ride, which used to be my, history used to be my subject in my undergraduate years. And the 3 battles of Panipat and 1 battle of Plassey, were my Waterloo. and I would always get their dates mixed up. They were actually so similar, like some 1526 and some 7. So I used to get all mixed up. And believe me, the description used to be right, but I was given no marks because the dates were not correct.
Yeah, so you were describing the wrong battle.
I was describing correctly the Battle of Plassey, but the description was absolutely right. The dates were wrong. So I used to get so confused, that the dates of, these Panipat dates. Yeah. Anyway, so that was just to share with you, your concern and how, the concept of history, that is there and the kind of emphasis. Now, one question before, one more question, which I'm tempted to ask. You have your all 3 books that explore the history of the southern regions of the country. Any plans for the north?
Not really. You see, one of the things I found is the north is disproportionately represented in this, especially the Mughals, for example. There is such an ocean of material out there with good reason. And, people often say, oh, the Mughals are there. There's this WhatsApp forward going around saying, oh, these people ruled for so many centuries. The Pallavas ruled for so many centuries. Mughals only ruled for 3 centuries, and we're disproportionately interested in them. The reason is because unlike the Pallavas, the Mughals have left, records which are still accessible. The Pallavas went away nearly 1,000 years ago. We don't have enough material. Even Vijayanagara, which collapsed only in the 17th century, we don't have enough material comparable to the Mughals. So the Mughals dominate because there is a lot of rich material, and they were succeeded by the British, and the British were obsessed with them, and therefore we are also still obsessed with them. But that said, I think there is, in India, instead of doing the same subjects over and over and sort of discovering new things within the same broad field, what I found is that, highlighting these slightly forgotten or neglected or footnoted subjects tends to be, for me at least, a richer and a more rewarding experience, because at least you're bringing to light something newer. When I worked on my Travancore book, people said, what is this Travancore? Who cares? But then after the book came out, they saw the matrilineal system of succession, topless queens negotiating trade treaties and leading people into battle, Maharanis fighting with each other where their husbands are complete non-entities, and it's the women who enjoy a lot of political power. It's not something we study about in school, but it existed in this sliver of India's west coast. So if you take stories from different parts of the country that are outside of the so-called mainstream, I think it can lead to much more interesting rewards, and make history also more interesting for the people who are listening and reading and so on, because they're not being treated to the same broad dish each time. There's at least some variety. It's at least a little bit of a buffet thing. You can go and pick from a larger set of options.
Right.
Before you wind up,
I have a
question,
question before we close. Manu, extremely well spoken and delightful to hear you. And Tino and Seema, you've carried this over beautifully. The question is, we've in the last couple of years have seen a lot of renaming of capital cities and roads and places in India. Is this only a recent political, cultural trend, or has this happened in the past also, where earlier kings and sultans have renamed cities, places, capitals for their convenience and with a political objective?
Yes, it has actually. This is not the fashionable thing to say, but again, these changing of names are also reflecting a historical moment, right? Even what for us is now the present, in 10 years from now, 50 years from now, people will see that as reflecting a kind of historical dynamic. Why is a certain, say, Islamic sounding city's name being changed into a highly orthodox sounding Hindu name? Because it reflects a certain political current that is dominant in the country now. So too in the past, you have all kinds of cases. Shivaji, for example, renaming forts. Martanda Varma in Travancore, he, for political reasons, he styles himself Padmanabha Dasa. He's essentially a conqueror. He's seen as an illegitimate king. And to surmount that, he transforms himself into the deity Padmanabha's servant and goes on this spree naming everything after Padmanabha after that. So his capital city, which was called Kalkulam, becomes Padmanabhapuram, because now it's all about the deity. The same with the Mughals, for example. Malik Ambar in the Deccan established a city at a place called Khirki. Then Aurangzeb comes in and he names it Aurangabad, and which is now the latest. They want to rename Aurangabad after, I don't know what they want to name it now, but yes, because there's that connection that they want to highlight. So these are in some ways cyclical. Again, the underlying thing is always political. It's not about reclaiming some kind of lost glory or anything. It is very much about contemporary politics. And just as we're talking about those people renaming their cities there for political reasons, so too our renaming will not be seen in future as some kind of great achievement, but as a very narrow political thing. And if you're willing to live with it, you might as well. But a bigger person would, I think, construct their own new city and establish something new and then name it, as opposed to renaming what other people have created. For example, Hyderabad, it was created by a particular sultan. It was actually created by a sultan, and given that particular name, wanting to give it a new name now is quite ridiculous because he made it. He had every right to name it. If you want a city, then build
one.
That's not easy. Renaming is easy.
Yeah, good. Well said.
So
well said.
we have some observations, many observations coming from audience, and Tejasvi also, has made a few observations. So Raghav, do we have time for taking up those observations? There is no question.
You can incorporate those observations in your winding up. Seema.
Another 5-6 minutes, if you can just take aboard those observations, because it's been such an engrossing, such an invigorating, such a wonderful session that it would be a pity if those observations were not taken note of. And I'm sure the audience will bear with and would be only too happy to share those thoughts.
Okay. So yeah, that is what it says. Tejasvi says we can go on listening to him. And he has made observations. And same as we, because they've been constantly, putting in the chat box, agreeing with what Manu was saying. And also, I can just read the balance, what Tejasvi says, the balance of thoughts for that age is mind-blowing. Usually we take settling down with our introspections, and then here once again he says true about kings and their agenda. This happens in administration too. The succeeding officer has to look distinct and better than his predecessor usually. And most of the Bijapur sultans had Maratha mothers, just like Mughals having Rajput mothers. And he gives example of Cheraman Puramal. The king is claimed by Hindus, Muslims, and other regionalist, religionists too. And similarly, Telugu presence in Vijayanagar court increased with the conquering of Andhra and Rayalaseema regions by Krishnadevaraya in first decades of 16th century until the Kannada was the court and inscription language. So there are, absolutely. Something about the courtesans as well, that courtesans, Madhulika, this is from Madhulika, she says that courtesans have long held very respectable position. Many of the irrigation tanks in the south have been funded by these historical women. Yeah. So these are some of the, observations that were running along as Manu was talking about, history and other related issues and ideas. So time we wrap up.
Yeah.
So Manu, just a question before I, just say the last few words. Your next book, and I just want to know whether you would be writing a pure or historical fiction someday.
No. As of now, there's no plan to do any fiction. I've learned that, there's always this temptation to dip your fingers in multiple pies. Someone recently, a couple of years ago, came with a rather flattering offer to do a podcast. And if I had fallen for that, I might have achieved something. But at that time, I really thought, no, my job is to do books of a certain variety. At least for now, I want to stick to that. Enticing offers will come from all over the place, but one doesn't want to become a jack of all trades and master of none. First, a solid foundation in something that I know I can do, something I'm trained to do, something I'm actively training myself to continue doing. And then maybe in future, the life is long. If there's one thing I have, as was mentioned earlier, my age at least is to my advantage. So I can use that. By the way, I turn 31 next month. So, my youth is very much a matter of history now.
Happy birthday in advance.
So, yeah,
so in future, I can do all those
things.
And
actually, Manu, we need a Tharurian phrase to, term your profligacy. I mean, 4 or 5 years, 5 years, and the first book coming out in 2015 and the second in 2018. And this courtesan, I mean, just a difference of 1 year between the two books. Amazing. We congratulate you and wish you all the best. But yes, wrapping up this session, we collectively make history, and all we need are unbiased, free thinkers and individuals with a reasonable rationale in a structured system for writers and historians to write about. And yes, that is a huge responsibility for historians, and Manu is doing his bit. So at 30, 31.
I'll only add one remark, which is that, unbiased is not something we can ever claim we are fully. Everybody has a certain degree of bias, but at least the difference is some people try to break out of that bias and try to understand their bias, whereas a lot of other people simply don't even acknowledge their bias. I think what we need to do is acknowledge our bias and say, look, I have this bias. How do I get beyond it when I'm doing something? And minimize the bias to 5% as opposed to 50%. And that is where I think the real...
And that's being realistic. Yes, that's being realistic. So Manu is, he's just turning 31, and with his 3 books, through his 3 books, he's compelling us to rethink, not just about the historical figures and actions, but the values and notions they embody. So but the irony, is that these ideals and truth were always present, but we probably overlooked the significant fact, possibly layered, because they were layered, and we picked up only what was more visible, what was more worded, and what was more convenient to us. So as a historian, Manu, you only, I think, lend us a 3D spectacle, I mean, as I see it, to ensure we don't miss out the fine writing on the wall. And oftentimes, the wall is nice, is colored, that relegates the writing to the background. And yes, with that hope that we are able to see the truth, we bring this discussion to an end with a wish that history is understood not only as a fact, but also as a story, but one that is enshrined in truth and some kind of freedom. So thank you very much, Manu, for being with us. Thank you, Anthony, for co-hosting, and thanks, team BLF.
Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.
Let's clap for Manu.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Manuji. Thank you, Mr. Disa. Thank you, Professor Seema, for this enlightening and scintillating session. And I was really excited for Manuji's session because I'm also a huge fan of his works, and the Courtesan Mahatma and Italian Brahmin being my favorite one. And actually, I really learned a lot about historiography and how one should analyze the text, understanding why it is written, for whom, what is the target audience, and what are the motives, and then only one can interpret. And how difficult it is for a person to kind of do away with all the biases and prejudices, but it is always good to try to kind of do away with them and have a clearer vision. Thank you so much, Manuji. Thanks a lot, Mr. Disa, and thanks, Professor Seema, and thanks all our audience for joining us. And I request you all to join us again tomorrow at 6 p.m. for another 2 wonderful sessions with great authors. And thanks a lot. Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye-bye, everybody. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
From all of us at Bhopal Literature Festival.